So special welcome to anyone who's joining us today for the first time and hasn't taken part in our previous Monday webinar series. This particular series was inspired not only by the fact that wandering has characterized the Jewish experience for 2,000 years, or really actually several thousand years, but also the fact that our own wanderings, as it were, our own movement has been restricted over the last year plus. So we thought about this summer series a little bit in terms of vicarious wandering. Maybe we are dealing with desires to wander more than we actually are able to right now or have been over the past year. So we're going to be exploring, of course, our wanderings between the land of Israel and diaspora from a variety of different perspectives, but also the journeys of Jewish books and plays across oceans, across time, even the journey from the current life to the afterlife. So wanderings through a whole variety of lenses. I'm so excited about this series and so grateful to our faculty for their creativity. And I think we're going to have a wonderful summer learning together. We're especially excited that our Chancellor is kicking off the series today. Chancellor Shuly Rubin Schwartz. And her session is entitled, "If I Forget Thee, O Jerusalem, the Idea of the Return to Zion in Jewish History." So certainly a core, perhaps the core theme of, with sub-theme of wandering within our history. And Tani will introduce the Chancellor a little bit more fully shortly. I just wanted to thank our sponsor for today's session. So Paul Meiji, I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly, sponsoring today's class at the Chacham level in memory of his mother, Rose Arbet Meiji, Rivka Rezel Bar Chaim Yaakov V'chaya Tirza Arbet. Thank you so much for making today's learning possible and for honoring your mother's memory. If anyone else is feeling inspired by this the opportunity to learn with JTS's outstanding faculty, we invite you to consider partnering with us by sponsoring a learning session. We have 2 sponsorship levels, Chacham for $540 and Sadiq for $1,000. And to learn more, you can email learninglives@jtsa.edu. So with that, I will turn it over to Tani to give us some additional information.
Thank you, Rabbi Andelman. Just to go over how we'll do Q&A today. Chancellor Schwartz will pause for questions periodically throughout the class, and we also have a Q&A period at the end. You can use the chat feature to submit your questions to Rabbi Andelman. During the Q&A period, Rabbi Andelman will select a few of the questions to present to Chancellor Schwartz. For any technical or logistical questions, please initiate a private chat with either myself or Lynn Feynman. The sources for today's class were in the email that you received with the Zoom link for this session this morning. We will also be screen sharing them as well. I'm so pleased now to introduce Chancellor Schwartz. Dr. Shuly Rubin Schwartz is the 8th Chancellor of JTS and the Irving Lehrman Research Professor of American Jewish History. Chancellor Schwartz has played a central role in shaping and strengthening JTS's academic programs, having served as Dean of the Albert A. List College of Jewish Studies, Dean of the Gershon Kex Graduate School, as well as Provost of JTS. Chancellor Schwartz was one of the first women on the JTS faculty and played an instrumental role in introducing Jewish gender studies into the curriculum. Among her publications is the award-winning book, The Rabbi's Wife, a penetrating examination of the role of rabbis' wives in the development of American Jewish life. So pleased now to turn it over to Chancellor Schwartz.
Thank you for that introduction, and great to be here with all of you. Excited to kick off this series today on A Wandering People, Jewish Journeys, Real and Imagined, and look forward to studying together. You know, I know that this series has been in the works for many months, so none of us could have anticipated that we would be thinking about the relationship of the Jewish people to Zion so soon after the most recent war in Israel. In some ways, it feels fitting for us to have the opportunity to think together about this long-standing longing for Zion that so much characterizes the Jewish people. But I think before we delve into that, I want to focus a little bit on the title of this series, The Wandering People, because of course we know the wandering people is very much connected to the long-standing stereotype, which is actually anti-Semitic stereotype in its inception of the wandering Jew. And so the idea of Jews as a wandering people in many ways brings together biblical narrative, myth, ideology, history. The idea of this as an anti-Semitic stereotype really begins in Christian theology, theology that held Jews responsible for rejecting Jesus, and certainly understood this legend of the wandering Jew as an example of the collective punishment that Jews deserved. And then, of course, the reality of Jewish exile for centuries served for Christians as proof of the rectitude of this view, proof of what happens to Jews who reject Christ, and therefore a rationale for governmental policies of expulsion of Jews. We even see this following Jews to the New World when they made it here to the tip of New York, New Amsterdam at the time in 1654. Peter Stuyvesant tried to expel the Jews, writing that we pray that this deceitful race, such hateful enemies and blasphemers in the name of Christ, be not allowed to further infect and trouble this new colony. So when we think about wandering Jews, it reminds us that Jewish identity has been formed throughout the millennia as the product, in part, of the way others have seen us, have imagined us, and the way we understand our own experiences. And this wandering Jew concept embodies both. Now, of course, Jews, like all human beings who have journeyed over the millennia, most people journey for the same reasons. They're seeking food, clothing, shelter, physical and economic security. But we also know that Jews have traveled, wandered, journeyed involuntarily over the millennia through forced exile or expulsion. So I'd like us to focus today is on the way Jews journeyed deliberately in their minds and hearts. In other words, for centuries, even when their feet carried them, or even when they were carried involuntarily from place to place, the Jewish psyche remained focused on the ultimate journey of returning home, a journey that would bring them to Zion, to Eretz Israel, a journey Jews longed for, prayed for, wrote poetry about, a journey that buoyed their souls, even when they remained in place. And as Rabbi Andelman said, as we have remained in place now for a year and are just beginning to emerge, this impulse is embedded in our sacred texts, in our liturgy, in Jewish culture, and it has nurtured the Jewish soul. It's kept our Jewish hope alive, and it served to bind Jews together, even as they scattered throughout the world. So I guess what I'd like to do is look at some sources with you together. Some of them will be very familiar to you and others less so, to just kind of look together at a few examples. There are so many in our tradition, in our culture, in our texts, but a few of the salient texts that will, I guess, exemplify for us just how long and how varied and how rich this thread of a longing for Zion is in our tradition. So, Tani, I guess if you want to share the screen, we're going to begin with a biblical source from the book of Psalms. Again, something that is probably familiar to many of you from Psalm 137. It is in the Birkat Hamazon, in the Grace After Meals, the early part that we see, but we may not regularly recite on a weekday when we're reciting the Grace After Meals. And it forms the beginning of what I remember in yeshiva reciting every day as the Pledge of Allegiance, Hebrew Pledge of Allegiance. So I will read it, and please follow along. Al Naharot Bavel, Sham Yashavnu Gam Bachinu Bizochenu Et Zion. Many of us can recall the melody that goes with that song, right? Which we often sing, particularly on Tisha B'Av. By the waters of Babylon, there we sat and wept as we thought of Zion. Al Aravim B'tocha Talinu Kinorotenu. There on the poplars we hung up our lyres. Kisham She'elunu Shovenu Divrei Shir V'tolalenu Simcha. Shiru lanu mishir Tzion. For our captors asked us there for songs, our tormentors for amusement. Sing us one of the songs of Zion. In other words, there, what they're saying is, the captors, the Assyrians, are saying, sing us the songs that were sung in the temple. Ech nashir et shirei Adonai al admat nechar. How can we sing a song of the Lord on alien soil? Im eshkachech Yerushalayim tishkach yamini. If I forget you, O Jerusalem, let my right hand wither. In other words, I can't sing a song and I can't pluck the lyre if I forget you, O Jerusalem. Tidbak lishoni l'chiki im lo eskarechi, im lo a'ale et Yerushalayim al rosh simchati. Let my tongue stick to my palate if I cease to think of you, if I do not keep Jerusalem in my memory, even at my happiest hour. So this psalm was surely written shortly after 586 BCE, when the Judeans were deported by the Babylonians. We can feel the longing for home and the defiance, that defiant urge to retain a connection to it. So just as they are being forcibly exiled, they are determined never to forget. And this sentiment was only further enforced after the destruction of the Second Temple in the year 70 CE, the destruction by the Romans, when again, some Jews were, carted off to Rome. And this is encoded, of course, in several different places in our liturgy. And of course, in 70, the destruction of the temple became an important moment for that intertwining of the Jewish identification with Zion as home, wherever they are, and the Christian determination that Jews were destined to wander the earth for rejecting Jesus, because of course the destruction of the temple seemed to be proof enough to early proto-Christians that God had moved God's allegiance to the new Israel as they understood themselves to be. So let's see now how this continues through our liturgy. We see in the first blessing before the Shema, Or Chadash al Tzion Ta'ir v'nizkechu lanu mehera la'oro, Baruch Atah Adonai Yotzer HaMa'orot. Cause a new light to shine on Zion, and may we all be worthy of its illumination. Baruch Atah Adonai, creator of lights. We see here that, sorry, I have too many texts in front of me here. We see here the way in which Zion we not only hope that God will cause God's countenance to shine on Zion, but that if we are in Zion, we will be worthy of a special illumination that comes from being in Zion. So it will not only be home, but by virtue of being home, we will be enriched. Then we see it in the weekday Amidah. Taka b'shofar gadol l'chirutenu, v'sanetz l'kabetz galuyotenu, v'kabtenu yachad me'arba kanfot haaretz, Baruch Atah Adonai mekabetz nidchei amo Yisrael. Sound the great shofar announcing our freedom. Raise the banner signaling the ingathering of our exiles, and bring us together from the four corners of the earth. Baruch Atah Adonai, who gathers the dispersed of your people Israel. So if the Shema reminds us that in Zion, all who are there will be illuminated, this is reminding us of the ingathering of the exiles, right? And it overlays onto the return to Zion the hope for redemption. That what will signify redemption? We Jews will be redeemed only when God gathers us all back to Zion from the four corners of the earth. This, of course, helped Jews make sense of their time in Galut, in the diaspora, because they could then make their own drasha on this concept and say only when Jews actually reach and inhabit all of the four corners of the earth, only then will we be redeemed back to Zion. And so maybe it brought some comfort to Jews to feel that, well, if we haven't been redeemed, perhaps that's because we have not yet been scattered sufficiently. Okay, let's continue on here. Just as a reminder that we, before we move to the sources in the Talmud, we do know, of course, that even in other places in the Amidah, we see references to Zion, some of them clear, pointed, and some of them indirect, right? We pray for rain, we pray for dew, but we're not praying for rain in our own neighborhoods. We are praying based on the needs of Eretz Yisrael, right? So even as we're thinking about the seasons changing in our liturgy, it is the seasons in Eretz Yisrael that we are pointing to. And of course, we know very well from the Haggadah that we end the Seder with L'Shana Haba'ah B'Yushalayim, next year in Jerusalem, another reference again to our recognition that wherever we are not home if we are not in Zion. And so even when we are here, our hearts and minds point to Zion. Okay, and this text from Talmud Bavli Brachot reminds us of how we pray, right? היה עומד בחוץ לארץ, יכוון את ליבו כנגד ארץ ישראל, שנאמר והתפללו אליך דרך ארצם. We know one who stands outside of Israel, we pray facing east from here, but from anywhere in the world, one should direct one's heart towards the land of Israel. And we know many Jews, many of us, many Ashkenazi Jews, I should say, have on the eastern wall a sign that says Mizrach to remind us always, not only when we're praying, where our gaze would take us as we think about, as we pray, as we live our lives, that we are still pointing our hearts and minds to Zion. And finally, in Bavli Kiddushin, we read Ve'eretz Yisrael gavoah mikol ha'aratzot. The land of Israel is higher and greater than all lands. It's not surprising then that the language that we use when we talk about going to Israel or immigrating to Israel, we say la'alot la'aretz. We go up to the land of Israel. We make aliyah to Israel. We see this here in the Talmud, that Israel is higher. So it lifts us up in a way. This goes back full circle to the piece that we began with, or Chadash, that we are illuminated in Israel. It lifts us up and lights us up. All of this is what we hope for as we think about, as we intentionally set our hearts towards Zion. So I think this is a good moment now to break, and happy to answer questions or hear your thoughts about any of this before we move on a little farther ahead in Jewish history.
Thanks, Chancellor Schwartz. So feel free to send your questions to me in the chat. So I have a good question that came in to start us off with. And I just wanted to note, you were talking about voluntary and involuntary wanderings, and it was something that we thought about in putting together the series, not focusing overly on or exclusively on the involuntary, because there's been so much of both. But the question that came in was on this negative valence of wandering, and the person was surprised at what you shared, that the wandering Jew is really has anti-Semitic origins, and was connecting it to Jewish texts. So I wonder if you could just tell us a little bit more about that, because I think that we think of ourselves that way also, not necessarily in a self-deprecating way, but sort of as describing kind of an unmoored existence for a long time.
Sure. Yeah, look, I'm happy to share a little more about the history of it. Look, there are precursors of this concept of wandering as punishment right in the Bible, right? We see this with Cain and Abel, right? That after the first murder of the first family, of someone in the first family, right? Cain is marked forever and is destined to wander. So that it begins already in the Bible, that this idea of wandering as a bad thing, as a punishment in some way. The connection in Christianity really, it begins, early on. It's attributed to Augustine, but I think it really starts even the earliest sources, I think, even a little earlier than that. So you're like 3rd century, 4th century. And this really was, ironically proved to protect the Jews, even as it marked them. As early Christianity evolved, we know it evolved as an outgrowth of Judaism, and so it needed to distinguish itself from Judaism. And one way of doing that was to make it clear that the chosen people, that God chose, that chosen, that special status, Christians believe, then transferred to them and not to Jews. And so they, the only way that they could understand that, honestly, was for it to be manifest that there was some disadvantage to remaining Jewish, right? And not accepting what they seemed to think was so obvious, which was that God was now speaking to the people through Jesus, who they understood to be their Mashiach, right? And so, that's what developed there. The fact that Jews had a status that was lower than Christians, the fact that they were forced to wander in the world, this was proof that God had shifted God's allegiance to, as I said, as they saw themselves, the new Israel. And I guess, when I said it was ironic, it was, because this view of Augustine actually helped keep Jews alive, because if Jews need to be around in a wandering state, then they need to be alive. So Jews needed to be protected, but never to feel secure in any Christian country in which they lived. And we'll focus more on that as we get into the Middle Ages.
Great, thank you. So 2 questions have come in that I'm going to put together about other denominations in Judaism, the Reform and the Ultra-Orthodox. So one person was pointing out that that the early founders of Reform removed those references that you shared with us in the Siddur from the liturgy to, because they felt that being committed citizens of the countries where they were living was important to counter anti-Semitism. So, sort of commenting on that tension. And then really on the other side, the ultra-Orthodox, who haven't changed the liturgy and yet don't recognize or support the state of Israel because it's a preempting of what should be left to the Messianic era. So how do we reconcile that with the vision that you've shared from the sources?
Great, thank you. So that's a great question. And in fact, the question itself, I think, in a way, reinforces the power of what we've just looked at, right? Why did Reform eliminate, for example, the Or Hadash al Tzion Ta'ir? That is out of every Reform prayer book except the Israeli Progressive Siddur up until this day, right? Why? Yes, they hoped that the anti-Semitism that they were experiencing, or rather just simply the impediments to joining Western society on equal footing with others, they hoped that if Western society could understand Judaism as a religion that had a parallel to Christianity, then it would be easier for Jews to find their place in Western society. And what was the aspect of Judaism that made it obvious that Judaism is a religion of peoplehood, that it is more than a religion, that it has the components of a way of life, of peoplehood, of nationhood, then this longing for Zion. There is no counterpart in Christianity. The longing for place, the focus on Zion as home. And so they felt, well, if we get rid of the peoplehood aspects and anything that smacks of nationalism, then maybe that Judaism will become a religion that other religious people, that Christians can understand and accept. Of course, that didn't work. And of course, the reform movement in the 20th century shifted back, particularly after the State of Israel was founded and is now very Zionistic. However, you are correct that many of these references are still not in their Siddur. On the other part of the pendulum, the ultra-Orthodox, they would see no contradiction to any of this. Their opposition to the state of Israel is really an opposition that goes back to the rise of modern political Zionism. So what they are opposed to is any attempt by human beings to effect this return to Zion, right? From their perspective, it is God that will bring the Jews to Zion from the four corners of the earth at the time of redemption, and that it is blasphemy for any individuals to try, as we would understand it, to partner with God to bring us closer to redemption. And they feel much in their understanding, that is not the role of human beings. That is the prerogative of God.
Do you want to take one more or continue?
Sure. Yeah, sure.
Someone was asking how you understand Or Hadash. What is that new light on Zion that we're praying for?
It's such a good question. I mean, it's such a metaphor. I don't know. You know, and I think I understand it in a very intangible way of what it means. I know every time my mother came back from a trip to Israel, she would talk about how, in a way, the kind of neshama yetera, the extra soul that we understand in our tradition that we can possess over Shabbat. She always felt when she was in the land of Israel. And, maybe that's a way of saying that you feel home. There's a sense of you can be yourself. There's a sense of wholeness, of completeness that one can feel when one is home. And look, maybe it is the extra burst of creativity that one feels when one is nourished by one's own culture in one's own society. So lots of different ways to think about it. I'm sure that many of us could give their own reasons for what that might look like or actually feel like for some of us. Okay, so let's I'd like to turn now, as many of you know, I'm a historian, so I'd like to turn a little more now to what this longing for Zion has looked like over a period of time, right? Over throughout Jewish history. First I can say poignantly, we read in the Talmud, and now we have evidence of this, that this longing for Zion had concrete manifestations as well. We have evidence in the diaspora of Jews observing what we read in again in the Talmud, that Jews should leave a corner of their home unpainted to remind themselves that their lives are incomplete in Galut, that no home is complete if it is outside of Eretz Yisrael. We know that, so we know that over time, as particularly in Europe, as Europe became Christian, and as political and religious leadership emerged in many cases, Jews were vulnerable in Europe. And while they were often useful to rulers because of the, in many ways economically, because of the trade and commerce that they were able to conduct, not being able to own land as Christians were, they were also vulnerable to not only to second-class status, but ultimately to expulsion. And as Christian rulers became more powerful, and as they consolidated lands into larger empires, they were able to use that power. So for many centuries, Jews fared well as rulers were building up their empires and consolidating their power, and as they felt that Jews were no longer necessary for them to do that, Jews would often be expelled. So you see this happening beginning at the end of, end of the 11th century, 12th century, etc. In England, in France, in many of the Germanic lands. And ultimately, when Spain consolidated in 1492, so we know Spain was initially mostly Muslim, and ultimately, and then you have the Christians begin, as they understood it, to reconquer Spain for Christianity. Once Spain is united in 1492, the Jews are expelled, and then in 1497 from Portugal. So by that point, Jews have been expelled from pretty much all of Western and Central Europe. We know that some of these expulsions were not finite, particularly in Germanic lands. Germany, as you know, was not united till the, well into the 19th century. So you have different municipalities, and Jews may be expelled from one and move into another, and then you have areas, as we'll see, where one city is under Dutch rule, another city is under German rule, and so Jews being expelled doesn't necessarily mean that they have to leave the continent, but it certainly made for an increasingly precarious existence for Jews throughout Europe. And I would say the expulsion from Spain and Portugal was really monumental, in that, of course, then Jews had to truly relocate. outside of Europe, many to the Ottoman Empire, to North Africa, some to the New World, as we know. And it also created tremendous theological turmoil and angst for the Jews to try to make sense of the precariousness of their lives. So it's in that context that I would like us to look at this source, which is, as you see, from the 17th century. So this is already a little bit beyond the expulsion. And she's living in the Germanic lands. We're going to read this selection from Glickle of Hamelin. She was born in Hamburg, which was a thriving cosmopolitan port of about 60,000 people. There was a Sephardi population there and an Ashkenazi population. She was one of 6 children. This is a small excerpt from a memoir that is a really spectacular source for this early modern period. It is among the only works written by an Ashkenazi woman before the Enlightenment, and it is the only account of an individual's personal life, so that we really learn a lot about Jewish life, although since it's the only one, we have no idea how representative it is of the lives of Jews, of the lives of Jewish women. She began writing her autobiography at the age of 45 when she was a mature adult, and she started writing after her husband died. She had 14 children. 12 of them lived to adulthood. She was a successful businesswoman. Jewish life permeates the book, and she's always looking for the ethical and life lessons that she can pass on to her children, in addition to trying to, make sure they're set up in business and that they all are married. She also wants to really influence the kind of Jews they become and the way in which they understand their role in the world. So you will see, and you will even see in this one excerpt, whenever problems befall her, and there are many, she herself experienced being kind of booted out from Hamburg and had to go to the neighboring town of Altona because, again, the ruler had enough of the Jews, got rid of them. They went to Altona, which was under Dutch rule, and then the ruler needed their money again, so brought them back. Precariousness, but not of the same degree that the Sephardi Jews had experienced. So the reason that we're going to look at this today is, as you see in the second line, is that she references Shabtai Tzvi in her memoir. So I'm just going to take a few moments to talk a little bit about Shabtai Tzvi. Shabtai Tzvi is famously known as the false Messiah. He was born in 1626 in Smyrna in Turkey. So this is coming from the Sephardi tradition. He had a thorough education. He was ordained as a chacham in the Sephardi tradition. He was a Kabbalist. And in 1648, he declared himself to be the Mashiach. Once he found the person we would now call his publicist, Natan of Gaza, he announced Shabtai Tzvi as the Messiah. And you can imagine, here are Jews very unsettled in the world, many of them having relocated in new lands, new languages, new cultures, trying to recoup their economic sense of security. So you could understand why Jews would be receptive to believing that that Messiah was coming to rescue them. So in September of 1665, the Natan of Gaza announced that within a year, Shabtai Tzvi was going to take over the Sultanate, and he would be ruling. So Jews would be ruling, Mashiach would come, and he would usher in Chevlei Mashiach, and Jews would then be returning to Eretz Yisrael. Again, you can imagine many Jews were swept up in this excitement. They really wanted to believe that Shabtai Tzvi was the Mashiach. Rabbis and communal leaders and some Jews began to make plans. So let's read about how this was experienced in Hamburg. Okay. So the writing is kind of small. I will read. At that time, people were starting to talk about Shabtai Tzvi, but woe unto us, for we have sinned. That's a common refrain in Glickel's memoirs, Mipnei Chataenu. She's always taking upon herself blame for anything bad that happens, right? Jews must have sinned. We have not lived to see the fulfillment of what we heard of and clung to in our thoughts. I recall how young and old alike all over the world began repenting of their sins. As it is well known, it cannot be described. Ah, Lord God, Lord of the universe, we were hoping that you, compassionate God, would have mercy on Israel, you wretched people, and redeem us. We hoped for this fervently, as a woman on the birth stool in great labor and anguish expects that after all her pain and suffering, she will rejoice in her child. But after all her pain and suffering, nothing came but wind. The same thing, my great God and King, happened to us. We heard the tidings, and all your beloved servants and children strove to engage in repentance, prayer, and charity all over the world. And we sat on the birth stool, yet after all that arduous repentance, prayer, and charity over 2 to 3 years, nothing came but the wind. I'm going to jump to the next paragraph. What joy every time we received letters, indescribable. Most of the letters were the Sfaradim. So we learn here how news about Shabtai Tzvi traveled all over the Jewish diaspora, without Twitter and Facebook and all of that, right? Letters were sent from Sephardi communities to other Sephardi communities throughout the diaspora. They would bring them to their synagogue to read aloud, and Gluckel, who's an Ashkenazi Jew, the Ashkenazim too, young and old alike, went to the Sephardi synagogue. Okay, they went to hear this news about Shabtai Tzvi. Skip about 6 or 7 lines. And what did they do? Some of them, poor things, sold everything they owned, home and all, in daily hope of redemption. My late father-in-law was living in Hamo. He now left his house and all its good things and moved to the community of Hildesheim to be a little closer. He sent to us in Hamburg 2 large barrels containing an assortment of linens with foodstuffs such as peas, beans, dried meat, and other groceries like prunes, anything that would keep. For this good man of blessed memory thought people would simply depart and make the journey from Hamburg to the Holy Land. Those barrels stood in my house for over a year. Finally, fearing the meat and other perishables would spoil, they wrote telling us to open the barrels and take out the foodstuffs so that the linens would not be ruined. The barrels stood like this for 3 years and more, for he believed he would be needing them for his journey. But this was not yet the desire of the Almighty. I don't know about you, but every time I read this, and I have read it many, many times as I've taught this text over the years, I can feel the intensity of that longing for redemption and for the ingathering that Shabtai Tzvi was promising to the Jewish people. I think about those barrels of spoiled food. What kind of depth of belief did it take to sell one's home, sell one's belongings, ship them all ahead in clear anticipation of relocating to Eretz Yisrael? As I said, Glickle ended up blaming herself and her people for their sins, but the longing for Zion remained. I think that, when I read this, it reminds me of the, of the spiritual melancholy that permeates her book, and of the impact that this sense of impermanence, of dislocation that has befallen the Jewish people, of the impact that that had. We often think about it in the aggregate, and reading this reminds us of the impact that it had on individual Jews, not only on their actions, but on their hearts and minds. So I think I'm going to stop here and see if you have any questions about this text and about the medieval period before we move on to modernity.
I have a whole bunch of questions that have come in, not yet on this text.
Okay.
Do you want to take some others?
Sure.
Okay. All right. So I invite people to send in questions on the text we just looked at. So an interesting question that came in just after we concluded the previous Q&A was, the person was noting how the Talmudic sources that you brought us were from the Babylonian Talmud, and they were wondering how the Palestinian Talmud, which was composed in the land of Israel, deals with the issue of longing for Zion, or is it different? Is it present? Is it absent?
It's a good question. I'm not a Talmudist, and I can't say I'm that conversant in the Jerusalem Talmud. But what I can say is that there are clear, the orientation is slightly different. If you're lucky enough to already be in Eretz Yisrael, your focus should be on Yerushalayim, on Jerusalem.
Another person was responding to what you said about how Christianity doesn't have the same concept of home that Judaism does, which is of course the case, and yet the nationalism, and the identification with home and the idea of home and diaspora exists among many groups, not in Christianity as a religion per se, but including in Christian countries. I think it's a present question given what's been going on in Israel also, because right there's another people that feels that the same land that we feel is our home is their home. So I guess it was just asking for some follow-up on, you know, the phenomenon beyond Judaism.
Great. Yes, I hope that this would come up, certainly. And so happy to talk about that. When I said that Christianity doesn't have the same attachment to land that Jews do, that is in a way to say precisely that Jews understand themselves as a people as well as a religion. We know, of course, even the word religion is a modern term. It doesn't capture all that Judaism is. So part of what Jews share with other ethnic groups and nationalistic groups is a tie to a place, right? So yes, you do. You have songs of longing for Ireland, for those who've left. You have that kind of longing among Italians who are here, many Greeks. You know, you see this in many ethnic groups where there's a real connection to land. And yes, Palestinians have a similar narrative of longing for home and sense of displacement from home. It is not tied in the same way to Islam, right? Although Jerusalem has holy spaces for the three major religions, it is different, right? Mecca and Medina are higher up on the holiness level for Muslims, right? Jerusalem is their third most holy city. So there's not a direct correlation, but that sense of longing and that narrative is certainly one that many people share.
Someone is asking, do you think that this spiritual melancholy and sense of dislocation has influenced how Jews, mothers in particular, have raised their children?
That's I don't know. I think I'd have to think about that. You know, I think it's something we're only beginning to really understand. Just that whole field of kind of whether psychological trauma can be inherited. So it's a fascinating question. I don't think we really know enough to say.
Do you want to take one more?
One more. Yeah.
Okay. So someone was asking about transitioning, the transition from a religious longing for Zion to a secular one in the modern era, and you know, pointing out that Hatikva does not use the same kind of language and sources that you provided as the foundation for us. So how did that happen is the question.
Okay, so that's just a segue into what we're going to look at now. So so I will answer that by moving on, and if I didn't answer it sufficiently, then you can, whoever asked can reframe, and I will answer it more specifically. But yes, let's look to the modern period. We will leap now to the 19th century in Europe, to the nascent modern Zionist movement. So part of what happens in the 19th century is, you know, in a way, a response to what I talked about before, based on the prior question of nationalist longings, ethnic longings. You know, the 19th century is the era of nationalism, right? You have countries consolidating. Germany becomes a state. Italy becomes a state. You have great expressions of nationalist identity, France, and a little bit earlier. And so Jews, and then as a response to that, you have a resurgence of anti-Semitism at the end of the 19th century, when Jews who, as we said earlier, when I was responding to the question about Reform Judaism, Jews tried to figure out what it would mean to enter Western society as individuals. And in spite of Jews becoming loyal French members of French society or British society or German society, learning that language, gaining an education, fighting as Alfred Dreyfus did for the French army. None of that actually enabled Jews to feel secure, that they were now at home in their new countries. And on the contrary, you see virulent anti-Semitism at the end of the 19th century. That then leads some Jews to feel that the reason that Jews will never feel at home is that any other peoples who feel a longing for home may be living somewhere else, but they have a country that they can go to. The Jews are the only people that don't have a country to go to. And if Jews could only have a nation like other nations, then even if that Jew was living in France, that Jew would feel secure. That was the rationale for modern political Zionism. And there were others who felt that what was really lacking is that even though Jews are more than a religion, they are a people, the concept of peoplehood and nationhood, they don't benefit from the richness of that culture because they don't, they're not in a position where they're able to be kind of like where their culture gets fertilized by being in a space together. And so those Zionists were more concerned with not a political kind of security, but a cultural renaissance, particularly reviving the Hebrew language, beginning to produce not only religious texts, but secular literature in Hebrew, theater, arts, music, to really try to build a robust Jewish culture. And these are two of many different strands of Zionism that we see during this century. And this in a way was a more secular version of what nourished Glickle in the 17th century, right? They too were longing for fulfillment. They were longing to be home, but they felt they had a plan for how to get there, either how to get back to Palestine, how to revive Jewish culture, how to create Jews who would be confident, secure, and therefore able to be full participants in in the creation of a Jewish future. So let's look at the last text. Great. And let me tell you a little bit about the author, Aaron Shimon Shpal. He lived in the Ukraine. He was a Jewish educator, and he was one of those early Zionists who promoted cultural Zionism. He was passionate about the revival of the Hebrew language. And as we can see from the memorial volume from the town in which he lived, Kremenetz, his home was the first in the shtetl in which Hebrew was the spoken language. So he was kind of the Eliezer ben Yehuda of his shtetl. The Ukraine was one of those areas that, first of all, had severe pogroms after the Russian Revolution, 1918 to 22. You can see this diary entry is from 1922. So Spal and his family was lived under constant threat of pogroms that they witnessed around them. His in-laws were murdered. He was arrested, and at least according to family lore, he was tipped off that he'd be arrested again and that he better get out of Kremenets. He wrote that he decided to leave because of these persecutions and felt that he needed to get out. So this is an entry from his diary, which I think captures this sense of longing that he felt. I dreamt sometimes of leaving this country, but for the sake of an entirely different country, of that country to which I am bound historically, love for which I had sucked in with my mother's milk, for the restoration of which I have worked all my life. I dreamt of leaving this country for the sake of that country, which, although I never was there, every corner of it is well known to me and loved by me. Each name as of those places that are mentioned in the Bible, so of the new colonies there, sounds so sweet in my ears. Hebron, Yerushalayim, Beit Lechem, Petach Tikva, Rishon LeZion, Merchavia. How beautiful, how charming are these names. There, to Palestine, had my heart always attracted me. And suddenly, America? What does the name say to my soul? What relation to me has Denver, Colorado, where I am to go? He wrote this on the train to Warsaw. He was, yes, indeed, bound for Denver, Colorado, because he was fortunate enough to have a brother and two sisters who had already made the journey, had already left probably a decade earlier. And so they could send money for him, his wife, and 4 children so that they could get out, and he was able to get his visas. So he continues here in the diary. He's describing the 2 groups on the train. One group are pioneers, Chalutzim, going to Eretz Yisrael, and the other group, like him, are going to the United States. He writes, there was a marked difference between the 2 categories. The Palestine pioneers were happy and joyful. The peace of God, it seemed to radiate from their countenances. There we go, with the Or Hadash, with their light in their faces. Each of them had worked in his own way for the Zionist ideal, and now, when it is destined that they be driven from their home, they go to Palestine to realize with their work, with their life, that ideal, an end to the diaspora. They depart from slavery to freedom. At last, we all began to deplore the dreadful position of the Jews in Russia and Ukraine, the ruin of the greatest and best part of Jewry. We came to the following conclusion. The last events that had ruined in a terrible manner the largest part of the Jewish people must open the eyes of all the Jews in the world to understand that only then we can be secured in the future from such ruin, when we will have our own land. All our hopes should now be turned to Palestine and America. As in the first, so in the second, we need pioneers. In the first, to build up the land. and the second, to wake up our own American brethren to give material for the building. Thus, we made up a compromise. Everybody's voyage is not in vain. We all will be engaged in furthering our national aspiration. In different ways, we will work for one purpose. And with the song, Hatikva, we arrived in Warsaw. There we bade each other a hearty farewell. The Palestine pioneers went to the Palestine office, and we, as American pioneers, to the Hayas, the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society. What can we take from this very poignant section from his diary? We see the extent to which the hearts of these Jews could burn for Zion, even when they were in Russia, and even when the possibility of realizing that dream was slim. We learned the extent to which it strengthened Jewish pride, Jewish self-confidence, and Jewish determination. It contributed to the revival of Jewish culture. We learned that in his eyes, the Jewish nationalist movement was larger than Aliyah to Eretz Israel. He, by the end of that journey, had rationalized to himself that he was just going to be as much of a contributor to the Zionist cause in the United States as his counterparts would be in Eretz Israel. And in the end, he did do that because he became he helped run an all Hebrew Talmud Torah, an afternoon religious school that met 6 days a week. Hebrew, Ivrit be'Ivrit, Hebrew taught in Hebrew, and did indeed contribute. He was a writer in Hebrew, a poet, and so he himself was a contributor to this revival of Hebrew culture. And he also reminded us that Jews can contribute to this revival wherever they lived. So I would say that just to kind of bring this all to a close, and then happy to take questions. Though Jews have been wandering for millennia, Jews never lost sight of where their permanent home was, and the importance of longing for that home was essential for sustaining hope, providing deep spiritual, cultural nourishment for Jews. It gave them a sense of mission, and it linked them to like-minded Jews all over the world. In the present era, we know that this Zionist longing finds concrete expression in the state of Israel. But as we've said before, we know that there are competing narratives by Arab and Palestinians who harbor their own narrative of longing and return. Nevertheless, the state of Israel retains a potent, if flawed, example of the flowering of this Jewish cultural expression that benefits now from Eretz Israel the world over. It benefits Jews all over the world, whether or not those Jews will ever journey to Eretz Israel.
Thank you so much, Chancellor Schwartz. I want to just talk for an hour about what you just said, but let me share a question. This was about the final source that you shared with us. So the person, one person wrote that it's fascinating to see this division of labor between American and Palestine-bound Jews, the idea that Jews could go to America or the West as long as they supported the Yishuv financially. So the person was asking, How common was it for that kind of agreement to be made explicitly? Or maybe it's kind of a self-justification or trying to feel better for his reluctant journey to Denver.
Yeah, I mean, for him, it was definitely a rationalization. He had no choice. He wrote elsewhere in that journal, "We flee where our legs take us." And when you are fleeing persecution, you don't have the luxury of, choosing where you're going to live. He went where he got money to travel to and where he got permission to enter. And I think it's interesting. He does mention support as if it's financial support. He supported it by building up the Hebrew culture in the United States, which, actually proved pretty important. If Jews around the world want to continue to communicate with one another, Hebrew remains the language that binds Jews to one another over time and space. But to answer the question more specifically, it is certainly true that over the course of the 20th century, after the State of Israel was founded, there very much was, and even post-war, I certainly grew up with the blue box, Karen Kayemet, of putting coins in every week for building up the land of Israel. So that sense of, if we're not there, we're providing financial support. And certainly that was true for so much of fundraising in this country for American Jews who felt the obligation, the guilt, the privilege of being able to support financially a state where they were not going to live.
Okay, so on that point, this person is not pussyfooting around. They're going straight for the core of it here. So I'm just going to read it verbatim. This sets up really what you were just talking about. This sets up the beginning of the strange relationship between Israel and American Jewry. They need our money to build the land. They provide us with a homeland, even if we don't live there. But since then, the relationship has changed. They still want our money, but claim we can't be too involved because we don't live there. We think our money gives us a voice there. There you go.
Yes, well, yeah, I mean, I would just say somewhat tongue-in-cheek, do we really expect Jews to get along? Why would we really have expected there to be any consensus on how Jews should relate to one another? But yes, there's certainly, I would say that the different ways in which Israeli Jews and American Jews understood Zionism and the different ways in which they understood the Jewish future has always been different, right? So American Zionism really only took off when Louis Brandeis became a Zionist, and he was very clear in his Zionism. It was a very distinctive American form of Zionism. And it was sort of his view of a progressive cause in the second decade of the 20th century, right? That American Jews were going to financially support a place where Jews could live freely, but there was never any expectation or desire to settle there. There's a kind of famous exchange that Ben-Gurion had early in the founding of the state, pretty much chastising all American Jews for not making Aliyah immediately, that Zionism is about Aliyah to Israel, not about supporting the state of Israel, or as the author of this journal entry wrote, that there's a whole rebuilding of Jewish culture. It can be realized in Eretz Israel, but it can also be realized anywhere in the world.
I'm just picking up on how you concluded before. I'm gonna take a little bit of liberty with the way the question came in. I think we can divide between religious Zionism and secular Zionism, but I think there are a lot of people who would identify as religious and feel the longing in a religiously rooted way, just as you've laid it out for us today, and yet are ambivalent about kind of mapping that onto our connection to the state of Israel. I remember actually this person's comment really reminded me an Israel rally that I went to probably 20 years ago, and someone was holding a sign that said, "Read the Bible. The land of Israel belongs to the Jews," and I just kind of shuddered in response to it because, right, my first trip to Israel, it was all about connecting to the places that I'd read about and in the Parsha my whole life, but that to me should not just be mapped directly onto our political views and how we relate to the state and the idea that that the borders should align. So again, just kind of extrapolating from a question that came in, how do you have guidance on how to navigate that as a religious person? How can a religious person who feels a biblical connection to the land of Israel separate that from politics? Is the question clear?
Yeah, I think it's a question probably many people on this in this session today are asking themselves, and I think that it's so important to be able to differentiate some of the concerns that we may have for decisions that the political decisions that the government of the state of Israel is making, and the relationship that has both to the reality of a Jewish state and to the longing for Zion that Jews have had through the millennia. I think the religious longing for Zion is an ideal that we hope to aspire to. The state of Israel is a reality, thank God. And there's always going to be dissonance between ideal and reality. We live in a country like that ourselves. There is dissonance. I believe deeply in the promise of the United States of America. I'm heartbroken by the ways in which it falls short of that ideal. I can feel the same joy and sadness when I think about the reality of the state of Israel. It doesn't diminish my my love for it, the thrill that I have when I'm there, and my hopes that it, like all the things I care about, that reality will come closer to our ideals.
I think that's a really helpful and succinct frame that you just offered. They're really two separate things that go alongside each other, but don't necessarily integrate at all times. So maybe we'll squeeze in one last question. The question is about the religious versus secular nature of the state of Israel. The idea that in the founding, Israel was not founded as a religious state per se. Actually, questions from a few different people remarking on how Israeli society is becoming more secular, and someone else remarking on how Israeli society is becoming more religious. I mean, it relates to what you were just saying about ideal versus reality, but maybe even if we bracket that a little bit, you know, kind of on the path that you laid out for us over the last few thousand years, or maybe it really is about the overlapping of the ideal and the reality. How do we want what do we want the religious character of the state to be, while remaining, you know, kind of mindful of the division that you laid out?
It's, you know, it's a good question that I don't have an answer to. I would just say, just say that religion and politics don't mix very well together. And so there are things that are thrilling about the state of Israel because it works on Jewish time. It works on a Jewish calendar. There are things that are wonderful. There are also ways in which when religion gets mixed up with politics, I would say that takes us farther from our ideals rather than closer.
I think that's the last question. Do you want to share anything final?
Well, I would just say that I didn't say this before, but but as I shared a bit about my own longing for Zion and where it leaves me, I would just share that the author of the last excerpt, the diary, Aaron Shimon Shpal, was my great grandfather. So that love for Zion, I guess, was carried down to my own generation. I too, like my grandmother, who grew up in his home, was raised in a home where Hebrew was the spoken language, a very American Hebrew for sure, but that sense of keeping Jewish culture alive and of the obligation of each generation to add to it and to help it grow. So this is one way of doing that, by teaching this beautiful text that he left us.
I cannot help but tell you that someone wrote in saying that Leo Shpal was the principal of their Hebrew school.
Yes, Brooklyn Jewish Center, excellent. My great uncle.
So thank you so much for grounding our new series in this way for us. I think the you know, this theme of longing is, I'm sure will run through many, if not all, of the sessions over the next several weeks. And I think it's a good, what you've shaped for us is a good challenge to how to work with our longing productively, given a complex situation that we've all found ourselves in. So thank you so much for teaching us this week and kicking off the series and sharing your scholarship with us. I want to invite everyone to join us next week. We will be discussing something totally different, the journey into the next world, the final journey, with Rabbi Eliezer Diamond. So a great show of the breadth of our JTS scholars, and we hope to see you again next week. Thank you everyone for joining us. Thank you again to Chancellor Schwartz.
My pleasure. Bye-bye.